Well, I mean, now we're going to have to be very careful because the term religion is not clear. What I've noticed is that the term religion seems to have actually been complexified, for good reasons actually, by the way, to include a number of other kinds of things that it is not. At least three. One is mysticism. Mysticism and religion are not the same. If your religion is mystical, then it's doing the wrong thing. By the way, if your mysticism is religious, it's doing the wrong thing. Another is spirituality. Religion and spirituality are also not the same. And then there's science. And one might say, quite obviously, religion is not science, but the point is that sometimes those two lines have crossed, and vice versa. So my proposition, so let me just sort of define these domains, and my proposition is one is that these domains are all real. They're all, by the way, necessary to any well-functioning human civilization. And that problematics arise when we cross domains, when we have one of them trying to do the other one's job, or we have institutional structures that cross domains and end up mixing them. So, for example, a lot of the problem that arose in the West was that the church, the Catholic Church broadly, was doing religion, spirituality, mysticism, and science all in a single institutional container, and ended up crossing a lot of those domains. So, shall I define them? Mm-hmm. This is worthwhile. So in the context of science, what we mean is the loop process where we have a model of reality. We then compare that to experiments of reality for the purposes of updating that model. Done. That's it. That's science. Science is the process of having a model and using experiments to verify that model is a good fit to reality. It exists for the purpose of having good models with which to operate in reality. By the way, technology is the inverse of that. Technology is the use of good models of reality to generate actions that are effective in reality. Right? So if science gives me a model of ballistics, I can then apply that model of ballistics to build ballistic missiles. Right? So those two things fit together quite nicely. Spirituality is very different, and it has nothing to do with models at all. It has to do with embodiment, with living. And we might say that spirituality is the way that an individual is able to achieve integration, congruence with self, and then to be able to enter into relationships with world that are able to be integrated into self. Right? So how do I come into be able to be in relationship with myself where I am fully integrated and congruent? And then as I go through life and have experiences, how am I able to ingest those experiences to make those experiences still part of a fully integrated self? Right? How do I avoid being traumatized by my experiences? How do I avoid becoming disassociated as a consequence of my relationship with my experiences, or being in conflict with myself? That is spirituality. And that's the essence of what that practice is. Religion then is kind of the community correlate. It's how does self enter into relationship with other selves to form communities, and then how do communities enter into relationship with world so as to be able to be adaptive to and thrive in world. Right? So it's the embodied practices that give rise to enduring communities. Right? That is religion as a function. Now notice what happens that when we run into problems. So let's imagine that we have these embodied practices, which are embodied practices. They're not stories. We tell the stories to be able to help us understand and to convey and to reinforce the embodied practices. But if we think the stories are where the truth lives and not the practices, we've now crossed the domains. We're now beginning to treat religion like science because the stories are a model. If you're not living your religion, if it's not actually embodied in your life, you're doing it a great disservice, and yourself a great disservice, and your community a great disservice. And then, of course, you can even worse, because then what can happen is you can then try to actually do science from religion. You can try to actually tell stories about reality, about the world, and then, of course, what do you do? Because if your experiments with the world don't inform those stories, do you then use that to change your embodied practices? That seems like it's not going to be very effective, because your embodied practices have nothing to do with that. You're crossing the line in the wrong direction. So what I'd like to do is demystify this damn thing. That there's a thing, religion, that has an incredibly important purpose that sometimes we might, oddly enough, some people have thought, well, why don't you call it ideology? At which point I refer back to the definition of ideology. Ideology is what happens when science tries to do religion. It creates a model of how people ought to live in community, then tries to impose that model on how people operate. That ain't the way to do things. There's very good reasons why that can never work. It has to do with the relationship between the complex and the complicated. Or why don't you just call it culture? Aren't you just describing culture? Isn't that culture? And of course, the difference is that culture is what you are doing. Religion is the doingness in a way so as to achieve a particular consequence. So religion is the process by which we develop a thriving and enduring culture. Well, that's not just the same thing as culture. You might have a shitty culture, and that's not the same thing. And religion is a vector. It's an orientation and movement. Just like spirituality is not the same thing as just being a person. Spirituality is a process whereby we try to achieve an integration of self with self and the relationship of self with world. Okay? Then you have mysticism. Right? Now, religion quite often crosses the streams with mysticism, which is very problematic because obviously what's happening now is they're trying to create either that becomes a variation of mystifying science, or it becomes a notion, well, let me just talk about what mysticism is. It becomes religion overcoding mysticism. And mysticism is the hardest. I haven't got a lot of clarity on this yet, but let me try it. It has to do with the pure relation of self with self. How do we actually become clear in self? So as opposed to how do we become integrated self in relationship with world, which is spirituality, mysticism is like, I think shows up mostly in practices like meditation, where you're not trying to relate self to world at all. You're just trying to get complete clarity on the nature of self. For example, here's a concrete version of mysticism, oddly enough. What are your values? What are your values? What are the actual basis of your values? Like kind of going deep into you. Not necessarily, not at all. What are your values in the context of living? But what are the values that are actually at the depth of you, that give rise to you, and are their orientation relationship? That would be like a properly mystical relationship. And it's mysterious because it is deep. And the only way you can get access to it is to actually get really good at listening to things that don't have structure, because they're not coming from the outside world at all. They're entirely internal. And now, of course, what happens is these things relate to each other. To the degree to which I'm able to achieve clarity of relationship to self, I'm able to achieve clarity to the nature of how that self works, well, then I can use that in my spirituality. And so mysticism, meditation is a good practice to have as a basis of a spiritual practice. But they're distinct, right? They're not the same thing. A spiritual practice may rely on clarity of self to achieve integration of self in relationship with world. And similarly, religion is a good basis to do science, right? You can't do science very well, let's say, if you're in a culture that doesn't tell the truth. If everybody's a liar, science is very, very dysfunctional. Well, religion is about how do you actually build people who tell the truth? How do you actually create the embodied practices like child rearing is a religious function? How do you actually raise good people? What are the practices and traditions and rituals that give rise to that can only really, well, so far at least, be developed in evolution time, meaning in relationship with lineage that goes over a long period of time? This is the thing that Jordan Peterson is, I think, most clearly trying to articulate in that space. Our archetypes, our mythologies, the ones that cover a lot of cultures and last a long time, do so because they are the things that have been most deeply associated with what has fucking worked. Those cultures that do certain things in certain ways endure, and we perceive them as stories, so we can listen to them, but it's not the stories that matter, it's the embodied practices. If you're not living it, you're not doing the religious aspect. And then we can invert it, right? Science, if it's done well, can tell us a whole lot about the nature of the world. So science can tell us, like, okay, well, what are characteristics that give rise to a self that can integrate well with the world? What are the characteristics of different ways that we can make sense and make choice as a community to more effectively thrive in the world? It's information, it's ideas, it's knowledge, it's insight, but it's not living it, right? It can tell us what are good choices, it cannot make the choices. Right? So that's the distinction between these things.